Good afternoon. There we go. A couple of days ago I read in the Globe and Mail the average income of the top 10% of Canadians in 2008 was $103,500, 10 times that of the bottom 10%, who had an average income of $10,260, an increase from a ratio of 8 to 1 in the early 1990s. Thank you for coming and welcome. We're here today to have a discussion on what does Occupy mean to business and how should business respond. We're delighted to see you all here. Just to set a little bit of a stage for what's to follow. Not too long ago I read a book by Robert Reich called Aftershock. Do any of you know that book? Okay. Basically, Robert Reich, and that's him in the upper right-hand corner, he was the Secretary of Labor in the Clinton administration, astute writer, economic observer. In that book, he had a couple graphs, and I've reproduced them. On the left, I'd like you to look at the line for the top 1% share of total income. And on the left, look at two lines, the gap between them, because that's the growth of average hourly compensation and productivity. Productivity on top, compensation on bottom. This one statement, in many ways, sets the stage for the discussion we'd like to have today. In that book, Reich says, our history is not quite a pendulum because we never return exactly to where we were before. It's more like a spiral in which we arrive at roughly the same points but at different altitudes and with some different perspectives. Yet each turn of the spiral gives rise to similar questions about the nature and purpose of an economy. How much inequality can be tolerated? When bets go sour and the economy nosedives, who gets bailed out and who are left to fend for themselves? At what point does an economy imperil itself politically as large numbers conclude that the game is rigged against them? Most fundamentally, what and who is an economy for? We're here today to talk about Occupy, and Occupy means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, depends on who you ask last. So earlier this week I went for coffee with Alex Patterson, one member of the Occupy Winnipeg group, and we chatted a bit about what Occupy meant and why it happened, and I asked him and wrote down his answer. Why did Occupy happen? His answer, just to set a little bit of a stage, we believe the system is being gutted from the inside. Occupy reflects major dissatisfaction with the results of the response to the economic crisis. We weren't aware how bad it was. People were willing to suck it up if it benefited them, but now it's the third world suffering plus us. Now it's different. Occupy is a meeting point for a lot of people who haven't been struggling together. Well, the question we want to ask, a couple questions, the main ones. First off, according to this picture, 951 cities in 82 countries had Occupy happen. What did Occupy mean? And secondly, given that we're in the School of Business, what, if anything, does Occupy mean for business? This is one response that we've undertaken. In many ways, it was launched and begun, this panel this afternoon and yesterday's at 177 Lombard by Professor Hari Bapuji, who not too long ago contributed to Managerial Conversation on an HBR blog on Occupy Wall Street, what businesses need to know. And this is one of the responses that's been happening here at the Asper School of Business, just to highlight a few others. Not only contributing to current managerial conversations like this one, also making leading edge. We've been seeking to make leading edge scholarly contributions on issues relevant to business as well as society, including issues of product safety, design flaws, more effective recall strategies. We've responded by seeking to facilitate classroom conversations on some of the issues represented here. Leading public conversations on things like economic inequality in business through panel discussions, the one yesterday and the one today. And let me also mention that there will be an internet forum coming out of today's event in which this session will be available to watch online. Today we're going to have a discussion, though, just a little bit about the format. I'll be moderating it. It'll run for approximately 90 minutes. We'll seek to end close to or shortly before 4 o'clock. We have 5 panelists with us this afternoon. Each will have about 7-8 minutes, a minute or two for clarification questions you might have. And after we've heard from the first 4, we're going to have a general time of dialogue, and then our president will offer his comments concerning what he sees in terms of this issue. And I'd also like to note that this will be videotaped and available on a website, and you can follow up with us later in terms of the specifics of that. Radhika Desai is our first speaker, and she is a professor of political studies here at the University of Manitoba. And just to give you a little bit of an idea, the questions we've asked her to think about is what are the key trends related to economic inequality in the world, particularly the developed world? And what is the effect of economic inequality on human development? Hari Bapuji, associate professor here at the Asper School, will follow. He'll be speaking on the relationship between business and economic inequality and what businesses might do to manage the effects of inequality on them. Brent Bailey, Asper MBA. He is with the Winnipeg Foundation, Manager of Advisory Services, and he'll be talking about how businesses are experiencing economic inequality insofar as it connects to what the Winnipeg Foundation is involved in and what they're seeking to accomplish. Rick Workman, former executive with IBM Consulting, big supporter of the Asper School for many years. I've asked him to comment on what he sees going on in terms of how economic inequality is affecting business and what, if anything, businesses should do about it. Dr. Bernard, the University of Manitoba president, is our final speaker. He'll be listening to what's going on, and in about the last 20 minutes, we're going to ask for his comments in terms of what he hears, and based on the discussion he heard, what he sees as the key reason why businesses should or should not address economic inequality, and also what researchers, educators, and managers might do with respect to this issue. That's our format. Let's begin. Radhika, the time is yours.
Lovely. First of all, let me thank Hari and Reg for inviting me to participate in this, I think, quite important forum for which the occasion is absolutely right. I think they have picked up on a very, very key theme of our time. I want to begin by pointing out that as a student of modern politics in contemporary modern capitalist societies, I've always noticed that it has been quite usual on the part of business to talk about poverty, largely in a charity format. So, for example, this year, the Financial Times Best Business Book of the Year award went to a book called Poor Economics, which is basically a very hopeful primer on how what businesses can do to fight poverty all around the world. But I think that this forum represents a very important transition from talking about from businesses and people connected with businesses, talking about poverty, to talking about inequality. I think the recent crisis has made business people generally realize that they too are paying paying the cost of inequality. So in the past, of course, over the last 30 years, as we know, as we will see in a couple of charts I have to show, there has been a lot of concern about inequality. And so one of the most popular and important books to have been published in recent years, looking back over those 30 years, is Wilkinson and Pickett's The Spirit Level. But does Occupy, what Occupy means to business, how should businesses respond, is, I think, for the second phase, in a sense, the concerns about inequality that arise from a new phase of inequality that is emerging out of the austerity that is being imposed around the world in response to the crisis, I think that this is a very, very important initiative, so it gets first prize from me. And I also note that the OECD just a couple of days ago has issued a report about basically chiding all member governments about increases in inequality, and saying that, in fact, also, for instance, things like wage inequality used to be countered by government policy, government fiscal policy particularly, in a variety of ways, but under the climate of austerity, after 30 years of neoliberalism, this is no longer happening. So that's very important. Just a couple of charts quickly to show you the dimensions of what we are talking about. Here is a chart I picked off just from Wikipedia, which shows the share of the top 1%, that's the blue line, the top 0.1%, that's the pink line, and the top 0.01% in US society between 1917 and 2005. And what I'd like you to note is the bottoming out of those income shares precisely during the 50s and the 60s, when in fact businesses were much more highly regulated by the state than they are today. And of course, you notice that before and after that phase, you have much greater shares of these very, very rich people out of the total national income. This chart is from the new OECD report. It shows what I want to draw your attention to here is the extent to which the English-speaking countries, in particular UK, US, and Canada, are particularly they display particularly higher rates of inequality. Canada is where I've drawn that arrow. And you can see here what's interesting as well is that these are trends in inequality for the US, that's the blue line, Canada, the red line, and the OECD average. Not only are both Canada and the US above the trend line, not only is Canada tracking the US more or less, but what's really interesting is that after sort of really staying more or less level through most of through most of this period shown here from 1975 to about 1990, including the Mulroney years, the Gini coefficient goes up, particularly during the great liberal deficit cutting era. And I just want to point out, here's just a very simple chart of world growth with the line showing you a 5-year running average. And again, the more equality, because you remember from one of the previous charts that these were eras of more equality, you also had more growth during these times. And you can see the 5-year moving average takes a distinct step downwards in the neoliberal era, basically. What is the political economy of inequality? By the way, I should say that if thinking about it, I know that inequality affects business in a variety of ways. It affects business politically. It affects business politically, for instance, by giving people with a lot of liquid capital, particularly financial businesses, much greater power than real economy businesses have. The businesses are affected socially. They have to, as Hari pointed out in yesterday's conversation, they have to pay much more for the security costs and so on. They are affected in a whole bunch of ways, but I'm going to focus mainly on political economy because people assume that actually inequality is good for business. Let's drive a few more nails in the coffin of that idea. Inequality basically decreases demand, as you can imagine, which in turn decreases productive investment because businesses don't expect demand, therefore they don't have any desire to invest. Sorry about the inverted, I didn't know what to do. I need a skill upgrading here myself, but that increases financial investment, which is largely unproductive. That in turn increases financial wealth, which in turn increases the amount of political power people who hold exclusively financial wealth have, which of course then once they have that power, and when something goes wrong, one string violin is simply more austerity, more austerity, more austerity, which simply then leads to further increases in inequality. And here I'd just like to show you very quickly a short a clip from a video with the economist Nouriel Roubini, who I've decided I'm going to call the Cassandra of the business classes, because he foresaw the present crisis, he was laughed at on TV, etc. And this is him in more recent times saying something quite interesting. Oh,
from wages to profits, inequality of income and wealth has increased, and the marginal propensity to spend of a household is greater than the marginal propensity to spend of a firm, because they have a higher marginal propensity to save, firms compared to households. So that redistribution of income and wealth makes the problem of excessive lack of aggregate demand even worse. So, I mean, Karl Marx had it right. At some point, capitalism can self-destroy itself, because you cannot keep on shifting income from labor to capital without not having an excess capacity and a lack of aggregate demand. And that's what's happened. We thought that markets work.
That's all. So basically, the point that he's making, which is simply that you just cannot keep shifting income from labor to capital and expect that everything will be fine. I talked about the political economy of inequality. I now want to introduce something else, which comes out of a potential title of a book I'm just finishing. I call it the geopolitical economy of inequality, because we all know that markets are interconnected. They are not global in my view, but they are quite interconnected. And here is Robert Brenner, who's very interesting. He's an economic historian. And more than 10 years ago, he wrote a book called The Economics of Global Turbulence, which keeps being updated and published in new editions. And in the 2009 introduction to the Spanish edition, entitled What's Good for Goldman Sachs is Good for America, which is effectively a critique of the idea that an economy based largely on centered around financial wealth creation can be sustainable, he says the following: against this background, and by this background he means a background of increasing inequality and depressing demand, of both ever slower increase of the world market and individual economies ever increasing reliance on it, because of course everybody in this era was told that they all had to export, they had to become export-oriented economies, which of course tends to contribute to inequality, because if as I'll come to in a second, if the country's citizens had to be purchasers of the things capitalists produce, they would have to be, they would have to get wealthier as capitalism progressed. So individual economies' ever greater reliance on it, economic accelerations in major regions had increasingly to take place as a zero-sum game, because the growth of the global economic pie, global GDP, continued to decelerate. These local expansions typically occurred by way of a hydraulic dynamic in which one leading economy or group of them took advantage of reduced exchange rate to undertake manufacturing-led export-oriented expansions, but heavily at the expense of others with correspondingly increased interest rates. This is the sort of politics of the Plaza Accord, the Reverse Plaza Accord, Japanese interest rates, exchange rate going up, down, etc., etc. This is what has happened over the last several decades, and obviously now countries are going to be much more reluctant to even pursue that. Roubini said Marx was right. I think Marx and Keynes both had an excellent understanding of this particular aspect of the problem of that capitalism has, that businesses have within capitalism. And Marx says in certain notes he wrote before the writing of Capital, he said, it is every capitalist's illusion, every capitalist wishes to restrict his own workers' consumption. Of course, he would like the workers of other capitalists to be the greatest consumers possible of his own commodity. But this is just how the illusion arises, that apart from his workers, the whole remaining working class confronts him as a consumer and a participant in exchange, as a money spender, not as a worker. But capital itself then regards demand by the worker, that is the payment of the wages on which the demand rests, not as a gain, but as a loss. What precisely distinguishes capital from the master-servant relation, a feudal relation, is that the worker confronts him as a consumer. But of course, if you're constantly trying to push wages down, then you ain't got consumers. And that's basically the problem. Rubini pointed out that you can't keep shifting income from labor to capital without creating a problem of aggregate demand. Here is a chart from in an article by two economists, Gerard Dumenil and Dominique Levy, showing the top 0.01% income share in total household income, total income excluding capital gains, and the three main components. And what I want to draw your attention to is basically this, that the capital gain in the 20s and 30s was, capital income was quite high. Then during the most productive and expansionary phases of the world economy and Western economies, it was exceedingly low. And then after the 1980s, it began rising. So finally, one of the other questions that I was asked to think about, and here's what I have to say, is what can business do about inequality? Well, at a macroeconomic level, I would say that businesses should be more friendly. And I think that, interestingly, real economy companies are typically more friendly towards public finance that is functional to full employment because they benefit from it directly. So I would say functional finance, that is, or public finance that is functional to full employment. Abba Lerner is the economist who coined the term functional finance. I think that should definitely be something on the agenda. A mesoeconomic policy of socialized investment, accepting that parts of investment at least will be undertaken by states, also engaging more in what's called social enterprise, which is more about producing and creating skills and so on, rather than simply about the bottom line. Microeconomic policy, pursuing policies such as living wage, which Alan talked about yesterday, Alan Freeman talked about yesterday, on the shop floor, fostering creativity, innovations, skill acquisition, retention, etc., upgrading, and so on. And finally, and this is the note I'd like to end on, increasingly I think that it is necessary going forward from this present crisis, and I think that for a variety of reasons, which we can talk about in the Q&A as well, is that businesses and business people should really see themselves more in a broader sense, not as rentiers, not as people whose primary goal is to live off the income of capital, but rather people whose primary goal is, and I looked but I couldn't find this, Antonio Gramsci calls business people somewhere organizers of men. And I think to see themselves more in that way. Keynes also had a very, very similar perspective on what was an entrepreneur or business person good for. Well, he said that they would be at their best if they completely gave up the idea that they should gain from the scarcity value of capital. He looked forward to the day when capital would have no scarcity value. And he said, though the rentier would disappear in his scenario, that is to say people who simply make money off the fact that they own capital, there would nevertheless still be room for enterprise and skill in the estimation of prospective yields about which opinions could differ. For the above relates primarily to the pure rate of interest, apart from any allowance for risk and the like, and not to the gross yield of assets, including return in respect of risk. That is to say, business people then would play the function of seeking out opportunities, really taking risks rather than the present situation where they take inordinate risks, but they never suffer from the consequences of those risks. So they actually take risks, they find new opportunities, they develop and dynamize society. I think that would be something that I would put forward as a self-image that perhaps businesses not only should have, but I think are increasingly going to have in the years to come. Thank you.
Actually, Scott has the mic. There we go.
I have a comment and a question. The comment relates to your comment about Marx and Keynes. From what I understand, I can't claim to have read them all, but it's not only Marx and Keynes, it's Adam Smith, it's Joseph Schumpeter, it's all of the great political economists have talked about the propensity of capitalism to destroy itself. My question goes to your graphs, which you pointed out. You pointed out they bottomed out between roughly 1940, 1960, and I wonder whether it was to what extent you think that bottoming out might also have been related to, and particularly not so much the bottoming out, but the subsequent rise, might have been related to the size, the nature of the economy. Because I think what you've seen in the last 25, 50 years has been increasingly large corporations, which again is predicted by all economists. This is what will happen with unfettered capitalism. And so that those larger and larger and larger corporations gain more and more power. And I wonder to what extent is it that the degree of competition, the number of competitors and so on is a factor in what you have, what those graphs show.
I think that's an important point you raise, but interestingly, what you will see is that both in the before the bottoming out and after the bottoming out, it is not so much the size of the corporations that are at issue. They don't grow as much as the financialization of the economy, and this takes two forms. One is that the financial sector itself grows, so that as, these statistics are now well known, but over the last 30 odd years, or say before 2007, 40% of all profits in the private sector in the US economy went to the financial sector. Do you think they were producing 40% of the value? I doubt it. In fact, the chairman of the British Financial Stability Agency, Financial Stability Authority, Adair Turner, was much in the news a couple of years ago when he actually pointed out, he said these financial companies are producing no value. And that it's important. And business people they know what they're talking about. They say we have to produce more value constantly. So that's one point. The second point would be that in addition to the financial sector growing, real economy companies themselves were becoming more financialized. So the typical example you would take is that GM Financial is as big as, if not bigger than GM's real production of cars and whatever else, trucks, whatever else they produce. So I think these two phenomena have much more, and this typically happens. In fact, let me add a third point. What is really special about that bottoming, the basin, so to speak, in the graph? What's special about it is that that was the era that in retrospect was called the era of financial repression. When you don't give finance its head, you actually get much better growth. So that's my answer.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask that Hari present his comments at this time. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming here on a Friday afternoon at 2:30. It is not easy, and particularly for a topic like this. I've been interested in researching issues that concern managers and society at large. Recently, in the last couple of years, I have been researching global financial crisis, particularly how organizations have responded to it with the help of a few colleagues. We have written a few research papers, and what we have seen is that despite the enormity of the crisis, we did not really see many changes that organizations have made. And also, the business leaders and stakeholders were not asking for too much of change. The dominant theme was, everything is okay, we just need to go on. And so that is one thing that kind of surprised us as to why is that nobody is asking for any change? The second thing was that we did not find the voice of common man. When I say common man, in the discourse that we have seen, it was mostly the elites. It's the academics and business leaders and regulators and other policymakers who were talking about the crisis but not
those who are in some way affected by it, like consumers and those who have lost jobs. Their voice was not there. So we were wondering, like, why is it so? At one level, the economic inequality or the rise in economic inequality has been highlighted by the global financial crisis. But despite that, in North America, we have seen a relative calm. In contrast, in Europe, we have seen riots, right? So we were wondering why. So then came Occupy Wall Street, and it became Occupy everything. It moved to a number of countries and number of cities, and so we thought one more surprising thing for us. So the first surprise was why nobody is asking for change. Second surprise was why such calm, why there is no uproar. And third surprise was that this Occupy movement has highlighted the economic inequality and the role of businesses, but nobody in the business community, either managers or academics, were talking about it. So then we thought, okay, we'll do something. So that is how we started writing and all that. So by now, like you know that income and wealth in the world is distributed like this. The top 1% takes a major chunk of it. The next 19% takes in equally major chunk of it, and the rest 80% takes a very minor chunk of it, right? So this has been highlighted by many people. When you look at it, at some level you might feel, yeah, it doesn't look too good that people in the bottom 80% are not really well off. But at some level you might feel a little bit uncomfortable, but it doesn't really hit us hard because it's a pyramid. There are people at the top are always going to have more, right? So the pyramid looks very stable, so it doesn't really hit us hard. But the way the income and wealth is distributed, it's actually not a pyramid, but an inverted pyramid, right? So this is how it is actually. So I want us to take a minute to really internalize this picture that it is not a pyramid anymore. It is an inverted pyramid, where the top is taking away a major chunk of the income and wealth. How stable will this pyramid be? Do you think it is stable? It's not going to be stable, right? So how do you make this stable? Any thoughts? Tip it? Okay, so tipping it is not an easy option because it would cause a lot of unrest and a lot of stress on everybody. What else can we do? So this is where the engineer in me tells that you can have some supporting structures, right? So you add some supporting structures. Please note that the supporting structures came from the same pyramid, right? The idea that I would like to convey is that these supporting structures do cost money and effort. It is not that you can just have something come from outside. So these supporting structures are called guard labor by Samuel Bowles, who is an economist at the Santa Fe Institute. So the guard labor are the jobs like policing and monitoring and security roles, which do not add anything productive, but just keep the system in place, right? I was sharing these ideas with an investment banker friend of mine, and I asked him if he really understood the word guard labor. So he said, yeah, I do. And I asked him, give me an example. And he said, university professors. You guys don't do anything very meaningful and useful, but you do make money. So, so I would like to disagree with that, but you really can't say anything to investment bankers these days. So now what happens to an organization that is in that society? If you're in the society, as you can see, it is now stable, but you can't really be sure that it is going to be stable. So what do? You try to create a protective cover around you. You try to create a protective cover, so that is going to again cost some money, right? And then you can do one more thing. You can also provide some support to the system, to the society, so that it's not going to fall down, right? Now what are these? These could be taxes, are lobbying. What you do is that you pay taxes, you pay more and more taxes so that the system could be kept in place through either social security or welfare programs. The other that businesses can do is that they can actually lobby the government for favorable regulations, and so that the system again continues to be in the same place. But what happens if the organization is itself very unequal? So you have one more problem here. That is, the organization might tip over, right? So you create some more structures to keep your organization in place, right? So that it doesn't fall. But the next problem is that the organizations are within the society. So no matter what you do, no matter how much you do, these turbulence in the society or any uproar in the society is going to affect you at some point. So what are these? So for you to maintain even a bit of a stability, you need to invest a lot of resources as an organization. So what are these resources? So to understand, again, I went to the economics. For the first time in my life, for my research, I have started going to economics. I always used to go to business scholars and sometimes to psychology, but this time I had to go to the economists. So Richard Wilkinson has shown that countries where the inequality is very high suffer on human development. So countries where inequality is high, they fare low on human development. There are a number of measures of human development like life expectancy, math and literacy scores, infant mortality, violence, prison population, level of trust, obesity, mental illness, social mobility. So a number of these are the things that actually do also affect organizations. I will come to that in a minute. But what is interesting is that Richard Wilkinson has not only shown it between the countries, but also within the countries. So between the states, within the countries, between the states that have that are high on inequality are low on human development. Whereas if the state is equal, more equal, then they are better on the human development. So what the point that comes across is that it's not the level of income that matters. It is not the average, but the dispersion. So you have to look at the spread of inequality. So now we have seen earlier about the health and social problems and human development issues, right? So I'd like to pick a few that actually have some implications for business. So let's look at the first. When there is high inequality in the society, I think the organizations are going to have high human resources costs. Remember that one of the components of human development is skills, math and literacy scores. So when you have fewer skilled personnel, as a business, you are paying more for the skills. So that is one point. Second thing that might happen is that when there are fewer skilled people, not every organization can hire them. So you may have to hire somebody with a lower skill and then train and develop them. So that is an additional cost. The second is similar to the guard labor, you have high supervision costs. These supervision costs come from the fact that countries in which inequality is high tend to have low on trust. So because of low trust these societal members have, it is difficult for you to form teams. So what you do is you have more supervisors. And then you also have lower mobility in the society. As a result, what you have is you don't see any opportunities for growth and upward mobility, so you're not as motivated in the organization. And sometimes you also have vengeful behavior. You think, this system is unfair, so you try to sabotage the system, sabotage the organization. And as a result of all this, you might have lost productivity. The third point is about the lower revenues. The very fact that the inequality results in a shrinkage of middle class. So when the middle class is not there, then obviously your consumption is going to go down and you're going to have lower revenue. So these are some of the implications for businesses. So what can companies do to manage inequality? So one thing that you can do is that you create more equitable pay structures so that across the levels the pay is spread a bit more evenly. One example that comes to mind is Costco, where they actively manage, they actively track the pay ratio of the CEO to the average worker, and that is less than 10. As a result of this, they see a number of benefits. For example, what they see is lower shrinkage. This is one hard measure. I mean, there are other measures that people say, like loyalty and trust within the employees there. But one measure that we can definitely see in terms of hard number is lower shrinkage. Shrinkage is the theft by employees, or pilferage by employees. So that is very, very much lower in Costco. It is 1/10 of what it is in the industry. And despite maintaining this pay structure, they generate industry-leading returns. And the next thing that companies can do is to invest more on training and development so that you can generate more opportunities for people. And then you also can manage the inequality in the society. One thing that you can do is that you can create a social equity division which would monitor the trends related to equity and see how it affects business, and create some strategies or develop some kind of programs that would address that. One of the examples that comes to mind is Pepsi, not exactly in the economic inequity, but in the case of health. Pepsi has been criticized for selling sugar drinks to people and making them obese. So what Pepsi has started doing is that they've hired their bitter critics, like people from World Health Organization and Mayo Clinic, and asked them to develop a healthier menu of products. So one of the products that they have developed is Trop 50, which has half the calories of regular Tropicana orange juice. That product is now making about $100 million per year. So you can create new products and services that would help the people. And finally, you can also provide access and opportunities to people or larger groups in the community. One example that comes to mind is Tata Group, which is an Indian company. I take the example of Tata Group because India and countries like India have seen large amounts of inequality, like they are quite unequal. But businesses have thrived there because they also invested in community development. So Tata Group, for example, has set up educational institutions, research institutions, hospitals for its workers and their families and the communities where they operate. And they've generally spent a lot of their resources on community development. So to summarize, we have always thought that economic inequality is good for business because it increases growth through aspiration. When you see about some amount of inequality, you want to grow up. So what you do is you create new products and services, so it is good for business. But businesses can contribute to increasing economic inequality because it is good for them, and also through narrow focus on short-term profit or shareholders and top executives. So those two are the visible loops on the top, but there are also much larger, much deeper invisible loops that could damage the business arising from economic inequality, that could damage businesses such as guard labor or human development costs. So to counter that, what you have to do is that businesses have to create another loop which would increase or which would improve the economic inequality situation through skill development and opportunity generation, and more importantly, through internal equity within the organization. So with that, I would like to conclude, and thank you again.
Perhaps time for one question before we go on to Brent Bailey. Anyone? Alan.
Just to add one point to that very fascinating presentation, which might develop it, which is that there is an opportunity cost associated with not employing non-guard labor. And this is particularly important when we now have 86% of employees in the USA work in the service sector. And that's a very long-term trend in all major economies, including China, actually. A lot of people don't know this, but employment in manufacturing in China is decreasing. It's the service industry employment that's rising. Now, service industries are typically human. And as I argued yesterday, more and more creative humans. So the humans are the indispensable element to all the fast-growing value-added sectors. That it's the crucial ingredient. So by reducing labour to the minimum possible and by focusing on guard labour, instead of investing in the autonomy and development of the workforce, you're actually throwing away the resource that you require in order to initiate economic growth. So it's not at all, I think it dovetails very well with what you're saying. You could add the opportunity cost, which any economist would tell you is something you mustn't do.
Yes, that's quite right. In fact, if you look at the United States itself, about a quarter of the jobs, at least that's what Samuel Bowles has come up with, a quarter of the jobs can be categorized into guard labor. So that is definitely an issue that we do face.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll turn it over to Brent Bailey, please.
I decided to go low-tech in my presentation today, so I hope my story is engaging enough. So I apologize, I have no slides for you to stare at. You're going to have to do it with my face. Again, thanks for inviting me down today. I appreciate this opportunity. When I was asked to be part of this panel, I started doing a little bit of research, as I think we all had to in order to get up here. But I did read The Spirit Level by Richard Wilkinson's, which has been referenced several times throughout this presentation. Actually, his TED Talk was playing as you walked in. And was fascinated by the research, and I think what he's done is it supports what most of us, I think, assume to be true, and that is the greater the economic inequality in a community, the worse the community seems to do on that index of health and social problems, which he referenced, sort of that level of trust, life expectancy, imprisonment rates, and the children's education performance. The piece I found most fascinating was that it was true when looking inside a community independent of its overall wealth. It's the level of inequality that seemed to matter the most. Most might say that the work of a community foundation puts us in a unique position, connecting donors to charitable organizations in need of funding. Or using Wilkinson's words, connecting the top 20% to organizations serving the bottom 20% in our community. While some may question that characterization, and it is a bit of an oversimplification, the reality is that of the $21 million of funding that the foundation put back into the community in 2010, 23% of it was in support of community service organizations, providing supports to the groups that identify with or at the lower end of the economic spectrum. In fact, another 23% was also focused on educational programs, mostly scholarships, designed to help students that otherwise would not be able to attend post-secondary school. I'll discuss a few of these programs in a moment, but I first want to tell you a little bit about where the foundation came from. The foundation actually was founded by a man by the name of William Forbes Alloway. He originally arrived in Winnipeg as a young man with nothing on his shirt, nothing but the shirt on his back as part of the Wolseley expedition back in the late 1800s. During that time that followed, Alloway had many different businesses and became very successful, though he never forgot his humble beginnings. He recognized that he was very fortunate in business and that it was important to give back to help the community that he'd gotten so much from. He was an early and strong supporter of the federally aided budget, which was sort of a precursor to United Way. And in 1921, he made the first gift to create the Winnipeg Foundation. His goal was to create an organization that would always be able to support the entire community, but most especially those who required the most assistance. Things have changed very much since that time, but the one thing it has not is the foundation's dedication to its vision of a Winnipeg where community life flourishes. After 90 years of working in our community, this vision is just as important today as it was when Alloway made his first gift, perhaps even more so. While our capacity to support organizations has grown significantly since 1921, we have found that the need has far outpaced our ability to help and shows no signs of slowing down. The need is growing. Today, we are seeing the dollar values requested increase each year. Our community partners are experiencing a growth in need for services they offer and are having trouble scaling up to compensate. We received 1,093 requests for funding last year, up from 902 in the previous year, with community service organizations like daycares, food programs, and boys and girls clubs accounting for over 1/3 of these requests, almost 350 of them, in fact. While we do our best to give some supports to many worthwhile projects as we can, there are simply too many to get to all of them. Of all the requests the foundation received last year, we are only able to fund half of the dollars requested, which has been our average for the last decade. Manitoba still has the third highest percentage of population assisted by food banks, with 50% of its clients being children living in food insecure households. Violent crime is on the rise, and programs designed to provide youth with other options than gangs are stretched to the limit. However, there are some positive things that are happening in our community as well. One of the measures that Wilkinson used and is highlighted in his research is the idea of children's educational performance. The foundation has long believed that education is a ticket out of poverty. And there are many examples that show that by bringing together the public and private sectors, we can achieve more than we ever could on our own. This is one way that we've been able to engage with business leaders in helping to address this issue of economic inequality. The first example I wanted to share actually is something called the You Can Do It Awards program. This initiative came out of a partnership between the Winnipeg School Division, the Winnipeg Foundation, Manitoba Advanced Education, and the Winnipeg Poverty Reduction Council. We recognize that there are many challenges and barriers that discourage youth from low-income families to go on to post-secondary education, things like inadequate grades, lack of information and awareness on making best decisions about higher education, lack of confidence, self-esteem, absence of parental guidance, and of course financial restraints. This program was designed to help students overcome some of those financial constraints. The goal is to create 320 individual awards annually, each worth $1,000. A student could potentially earn an award in each year from grades 5 through to grade 12, resulting in a total award of $8,000. Each award is funded by a combination of dollars from the Winnipeg Foundation, the province of Manitoba, local businesses, and individual donors. Awards are based on a number of criteria that encourage students to achieve good grades, attend classes, demonstrate hard work, volunteerism in the community. And these monies are held in trust for them should they decide to go for school, and at which time they can tap into that, and we certainly will help with the tuition. Another example of this, led by the Business Council of Manitoba, is the Aboriginal Education Awards. The Business Council of Manitoba was formed in 1998 and is a cross-section of CEOs of larger Manitoba-based companies. The Council's goal is to make Manitoba a preferred place to live, work, and invest. These scholarships are available to status, non-status, Métis, and Inuit students who are attending Manitoba University and community colleges. The scholarships are for 1 year, $3,000 per year for university, $1,500 for community college, and recipients can reapply year over year for continued support. But what's really neat is each of the scholarship recipients actually also receive summer employment from one of the member businesses, member of the councils. In the first year, this program received more than 120 applications and awarded 74 scholarships. The Government of Canada and the province of Manitoba are matching funding partners up to a maximum of $150,000 per year. In the past decade, this program has grown to see over 1,118 students receive awards to the tune of over $2.8 million. As Manitobans, we're very privileged to live in a generous province, or the most generous province in Canada. Each year when Statistics Canada releases the numbers, Manitoba is always at the top for percentage of tax filers claiming charitable contributions. In fact, it was 26.3% in 2009. And of those who give, Manitobans give the highest percentage of what they have, and by a wide margin, and that's about at 1% of our incomes. Much of the reading I've done concerning the issue of economic inequality calls for business to look at whether existing models of compensation are contributing to this inequality, suggesting businesses find new ways to reward performance without increasing pay disparities. Some have even suggested that big business philanthropists as Gates or Buffett are best positioned to engage the Occupy movement in a dialogue trying to find common ground. While I support these approaches, I might suggest another. Our CEO, Richard Frost, posted a blog earlier this week that highlighted these giving statistics along with a challenge. There are many great provinces in our community that cannot happen because the need far exceeds our capacity to grant. Yes, Manitobans lead the nation in giving, but there's an opportunity to do better, an opportunity for those in that top 20% to support organizations working hard to narrow that economic gap. If Manitoba grows its giving leadership by 0.5% annually, that would result in more than $200 million being added to the amount donated in a given year. Can you imagine if Canada followed that same trend? A similar increase of 0.5% nationally would see more than $5 billion added to resources made available to these organizations. There are many things that business can do, and I'm sure we've heard some today, and I'm sure we'll hear more before this panel is done. There's no one solution, but I have given you some examples of what business is doing today to effect change in our community. Working together with business, engaging the community, there's no limit to what we can accomplish. Thank you very much.
Is there a question for Brent before we continue on to Rick Workman? I'm just struck by the number 1,093 as opposed to 902. That's over a 20% jump. And there could be a lot of reasons, but I think one of them could be related to what we're talking about here.
I would certainly agree with that, absolutely.
Quick question before we turn it over to Rick. Oh, Rakesh, right behind you.
Just a comment, I heard that Winnipeg Foundation has also introduced another program for helping children who are undernourished and for food, etc. I think that's a very innovative program. It has a strong appeal, at least as far as I'm concerned. Of course, other organizations have an appeal in terms of getting my money for charity, but that kind of program really tugs into my heart. So I think we need to come up with innovative programs that really deal with inequality and who are the people who are suffering from inequality.
I appreciate you bringing that up. It was tough to pick a few examples of what to highlight today, but what you're referring to is our Nourishing Potential program that is focused on enhancing the existing food services programs in existing institute schools and community clubs. We did a research project actually in conjunction with the university, actually in conjunction with the Asper School to be specific, looking at the issue of food deserts in the inner city, and found that food deserts in fact do exist. And what I mean by food desert is not only having the lack of food available, but the quality of food that is available not being of certain nutrition standards. So focusing on nutritional training, providing food to students, ranging right from, as I mentioned, sort of grade 5, but really right up to the age of 25. But also not just providing the food, but educating them on how to prepare their own food going forward. And I mean, we could talk about the examples of that all day, but happy to take that offline if you want more information.
Thank you. Rick, the time is yours.
Thank you. I've never been a university professor. I've always worked in the business world, and I'm one of these people who graduated in 1969 with an engineering degree. I grew up on a small farm without running water, and my dad said, you got to get an engineering degree because you'll get a good job. So I joined IBM. And at that time, computers, nobody knew what they were. So in many ways, I consider myself fortunate because I've seen a tremendous evolution in terms of no one knowing what a computer was until today. It's pervasive through almost everything we do. A couple of comments that I feel very strongly about. CEO leadership. I don't listen to any CEO who makes 100 times what his average employee or average employee makes. Even though they may say to me, we have your best interests at heart as an employee, and we've got you in mind. Do you think they deserve 100 times pay what the average person makes? No. The Occupy movement is really good because it's causing us to finally reflect on some issues in our society. Let's talk about the 99 versus the 1%. Who are the 1%? About a month ago, Maclean's magazine, Andrew Coyne had an article talking about what income in Canada do you have to make to be in the 1%. According to the 2008 CRA, it's $176,000. In America, it's $455,000. Now, if you're a Manitoban making $176,000, you're going to pay $60,000, $70,000 in tax. You're going to be left with $100,000, $110,000. You're not going to become wealthy. You have a good standard of living, a great standard of living. So we somehow have to put some definition around who are the 1% and who are the 99% and what does it all mean. Now I'll give you my experience. When Reg asked me to present, I wasn't sure what I was going to say, and then I saw in every IBM office there's a plaque and it says world peace through world trade. World peace through world trade. Now when I joined in '69, What that meant was, in North America, we manufactured, we put everything together, and we shipped it all over the world. And the company was phenomenal. Yes, there were employees in other parts of the world, but basically they were a small group who looked after installation of the equipment because all the intellectual capital and all the knowledge was in North America. Company grew to roughly 400,000 people. Now what I see is we also have, if you look at IBM, huge multinational, 400,000 people. There's over 100,000 in India. There were a handful when I joined in '69. There's a big bunch in Brazil. There's a whole bunch now starting up in China. But the total headcount has stayed the same. So what's happening? It's called globalization. And in globalization, there's winners and there's losers. Now, I happen to still believe in world peace through world trade because as this globalization occurs, the standard of living is going up for many people in India and China, and they are, by the way, doing much better, and they have an opportunity to perhaps enjoy the same standard of living that we all have enjoyed, and that's very good. But there are also losers back here. When I first started working, I joined an organization that was almost paternalistic. You've got lifetime employment, great benefit package, as long as you perform. And there was always yearly performance analysis, and some people got let go or fired because they weren't performing. Now, it's what I call self-sufficiency. You're responsible for your own skills, and you can either be someone who takes advantage of an opportunity, or you can be a survivor, or you can be dead by your downsized right size, and suddenly your job has disappeared. So you may sit there and say, well, that's technology. You know, that affects people who are working in this IT industry. No, you'd be wrong. If you're thinking that, you'd be wrong. Because it's not just the programmers. So if you get a computer science degree, and I've spoken to the computer science faculty, by the way, they don't invite me back anymore because they don't like what I have to say. I said, if you're going to be a software programmer, be careful because those jobs are leaving Canada and they're all going offshore. Why are they going offshore? Because certain countries, India being one of them, they focus on computer science, engineering. They focused on occupations and university courses which industry wants. Until recently, what was our most popular degree in Canada? Psychology. I listened to the radio on the way in, Memorial Park. A woman called in, a young woman, she said, I've got an undergraduate degree in anthropology and the only job I can get is a waitress. What do you do with a degree in anthropology? Did no one ever tell her she should go on and get a PhD or a master's degree? Did no one ever say to her, if you're just going to stop there, it's just not good enough? The globalization phenomena, we know all about call centers, right? We say, well, yeah, that's a call center. We've all dealt with people in India and so on. But let me give another example of a call center. Today, if you have your computer and it doesn't work, we have very talented people in India who take control of that computer, who actually do all the fixes and do all the technical work from India on your PC. I called recently, and while I was waiting for the person in India to power it up, she said, how are the Blue Bombers doing? And I said, what? I said, how did you know that? She said, well, when you call from an 204 area code, the computer says, Blue Bombers, talk to them about football while you're, while you're going through the wait time. And by the way, they take courses on accents. So they love hiring people from the Midwest because we tend to be accent neutral. And they take a month's training on trying to get the accent right. People I've worked with from these organizations are hard-working, talented people. These people are good. I would say it is a generalization. They have good skills. They work hard. What they miss is creativity and innovation. It's almost like going up the food chain. So as this globalization happens, and people who, but Accounting. Do you know that more and more in the United States, accounting is being outsourced to India? Well, I read that a lot of financial returns now are done over there. Radiology. If you go every day down to a dark room like a mole and look at x-rays, do you think you have to do it in Winnipeg? If somebody else has the skills somewhere else? The networking costs are so cheap, the technology is so pervasive. So the globalization makes winners and losers. If you have, here's my advice first as a person, if I was you today. Be careful you don't get into a career where it's just you and the computer, or you not interacting with your client base, because that job could be prone to be moved somewhere else. In IBM today, all the back office accounting and so on is Brazil. When you have these ERP systems, enterprise resource programs like SAP, CBOL, and so on, those are being pervasively installed through all the big multinational corporations. What it also allows them to do is to move the work where the skills are and where the knowledge workers are. And we're talking about knowledge workers. It's not like having to move a manufacturing plant or something which requires a big capital investment. This is something you can fairly easily facilitate. Guard dogs, or I call guard dogs, guard labor. I want to talk about that because what business needs to do, and there's only one, I believe only one hope through all of this. You're not going to really stop the globalization phenomena. The most important thing we can do lies in this room. It's education. And I've been very vocal. An example of terrible public policy is a tuition freeze we had in Manitoba. There are ways to ensure people who don't have the resources go to university without a tuition freeze, because we can't starve our universities. Our universities are the investment in the future. I would like to see more money going to universities, both as a taxpayer and as business providing support, because that's the long-term thing. But I haven't got answers, I've only got questions when we talk about university. It really bothered me when Brandon University went on strike. Why does a university go on strike? Do professors care about their students? It bothers me when I hear from my children, you know, we have terrible professors. They can't teach, yet they last year after year because they have tenure. Why does that go on? Shouldn't we have the best professors? Shouldn't this school be known as one of the best in Canada for a business school? We could do that. Because one thing about living in Winnipeg, the partnership between academia and business is fairly easy to do. It's a size where we could do this. I can't tolerate incompetence. If people can't do their job effectively, and you're teaching to young minds, you shouldn't be in the occupation. High school, did you see in the free press? We're last in physics and mathematics in our public school system. What did the head of the Manitoba Teachers Association say? It's not so bad. The big gap between the bottom and the top is not so great, because they don't want individualized testing or standardized testing. Why do you have to be protected by guard labor so that you don't have to perform and do the best you can be? So this real objective, I think, is education, but the right education. When do we ask ourselves, when these young people come to university, who tells them about their careers? And by the way, if you get an undergraduate degree in anthropology, there's a good chance you're going to end up being a waitress. Does anyone tell that? Or do we just take their application and take their money and say, let's put them through the factory and let it land where it may? It has to change, because I really believe this is what it's all about for us to be competitive as a society and for us to take advantage of that globalization. Sorry for getting on my soapbox about this, but it's something I feel quite strongly about, and it has to be said. That's why when Reg called me this morning and said, "Would you come here?" I said, this might be an opportunity to get something out on the table that I feel quite strongly about. Thank you.
The Wizard of Oz just came to mind. Not only are we not in Kansas, we also can't go back. The way forward, we're going to get onto that in just a moment. Let's take a question for Rick, and then we'll move on to the broader panel, and then hear from the President.
Press the button. I guess one point and then a response to the tenure point at the end. Milton Friedman argued that the business has only one fiduciary responsibility, and that's to maximize profits. Anything else is something that's simply unacceptable. It's their maximizing shareholder value is what they're supposed to do. And I would argue that Marx would agree with that. It's interesting the two of them would agree. And so profitability is critical to them. Now, Radeka would argue that Keynes and Marx would argue there are paradoxes of that for the system. The systems can sometimes will have crisis, whether it's because of ineffective demand or falling rate of profit. Those are nuanced debates for another point. But business is doing what it's doing. And so the world has been driven to huge inequality. It's been driven to crisis. It's been done because of central bank activity, fiscal policy on the part of the state, deregulation. And I don't hear much from the business community out there talking about raising their taxes or re-regulating the president of Goldman Sachs said he's doing God's work. And so the question then becomes, can we really rely on the business community? I actually teach Wilkinson. And one of the criticisms of Wilkinson is there's no agency in Wilkinson. Here are the events of inequality. But how do we deal with inequality? And the answer is, if you look at Wilkinson's top economies where equality actually works better, every one of them is not because of the goodwill of the business community. It's because these states are contested by labor and labor parties. It's Sweden and Finland and Norway that are the countries that do best at Wilkinson's ratings. And in those cases, in every one of those cases, the state is contested by a strong working class and strong labor parties and environmentalists. Anywhere where there isn't that strength, the business community has not created that kind of equality. And these are not places where there's a charity model, where we rely on the business community to provide some funds to fill in the gaps created by the marketplace. Systematic state funding, as Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, taxes are the price of civilization. And as for here's the last comment. Tenure is the University of Manitoba and every other place to protect us from business people who might not like the fact that we're critical of IBM and other corporations. And without tenure, there's a long historical record, which I won't go on, that suggests exactly why tenure is needed. You may say there's incompetent profs, but we argue there's a really dangerous business community out there that will threaten our academic freedom.
Rick, you want to respond to that before we open it up wide?
Yeah, it's I've never experienced that, to be honest, in all the people I've worked with. But you made me think of one thing I didn't make in my remarks. What is the responsibility of business with the Occupy movement? Business cannot give me a guarantee of a job forever, but business can make sure that they're giving me the opportunity to always have the right skills and to ensure I know where things are going so I don't get surprised. So if they're investing in me, and I would say what's happened with the short-term profit fix and this whole globalization, business is not investing in people the way they used to. And it's more up to me to do it, which is fine to a point, but I see a huge shortfall. And so what business and the university has to work together to invest in people, come up with the right educational programs and the skills, and to make it work. I think there is an appetite to do that, and I'm hoping that this Occupy movement does that. Quite honestly, I've never heard a serious conversation about anybody in business attacking the university. If anything, I've always heard positive comments in my experience. Yeah, please do, because I'm not saying it's not there, I've just not experienced it.
Let's open it up to the wider audience. Are there any questions? We're going to take one or two, and then the president will conclude our gathering with his thoughts. Anyone at all? Paul, Scott, you want to hand the microphone?
Thanks. I want to ask the question I asked last night with a little bit of an introduction, and the question I asked last night was about power. I don't think the Occupy movement is primarily, or let us say fundamentally, about differences in income. It's about differences in power. We have large corporations that are run by a very small group of people, a CEO, board of directors, and these people have power. There's no question about it. And they extract and are able to extract extremely large salaries and rewards for themselves because it doesn't affect the bottom line of a large corporation. It's the fourth, fifth, sixth significant figure. But typically your labor is about 50% of your costs. That can be reduced and is reduced. And so we see this pressure downward. I mean, I could talk about this for a long time, but I really want the panel's reaction to this, that it's really power differences that make the difference. And unless we really address that fundamental issue of differences in power, I think we won't address the issue of differences in wealth, and we won't address the problem.
Any thoughts from the panel? Is it really all about power?
I tried answering it yesterday, and I don't think I have done a good job. So I'll let you take a shot at it, and then I have something to say.
Okay, well, I guess I am the political scientist on the panel, so I ought to be able to answer it. But let's see if I give satisfaction here. I think that I agree with you that it is about power. But once in a modern capitalist society, the economy does take on a sort of autonomy of its own, so that once you create the structures in which inequality is exacerbated, then it does take on an economic autonomy. But I completely agree with you that it is about power. And I want to say a couple of other things which also relate to some of the things that Robert there was saying. Very briefly, if you remember in the charts that I showed, the basin element, I mean, that was experienced in practically every society around the world in one form or another, that there was a massive flattening of inequality, et cetera, et cetera. Now, and then also great growth. So, I mean, the two went together. That was precisely because the 1940s were a decade of great social mobilization. When Hari first proposed that we should have this panel, immediately, I'm from India originally like Hari, and my immediate thought was to say, it's so interesting in India, in India I grew up in, which is, by the way, no longer when I go back, I do not recognize it in many places. But it was a society in which we didn't call capitalists, we called them industrialists. Now, maybe we were deluding ourselves, I don't know. But there's a definite sense in which there was a sense that the government and the business class was engaged in a larger joint enterprise. And indeed, in the independence movement, there was something called the Bombay Plan, which the industrialists put forward, which was effectively some kind of a plan to increase the size of the domestic market, which would then allow industry to expand, et cetera, and completely envisaging a big role for the state, including state-owned industries, all those things. I mean, one can get, I just want to put that out. So I think it's about power, and I think when you have, so the period that we're talking about, in the West particularly, where you have seen huge amounts of inequality develop over the last 30 years, what did the period begin with? In the two most important English-speaking countries, in the UK and in the United States, they began with a huge war on trade unions. Sorry? It began with a huge war, an attack on trade unions. Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, each in their own way, took on the trade unions and massively reduced union density in their respective countries. Okay, so I think that I agree, it is about power, but the reason we also talk about the economy is because it takes on then a dynamic of its own, which has a feedback loop. So we're living at the moment in a time where, despite the fact that the people who caused the crisis continue to have so much power in the capitals of the Western world, that not only do they get bailed out, but they get further installments of policies that are throttling the economy while preserving the value of their investments. That is indeed power.
Okay. I think this question that you've raised and the question earlier about businesses doesn't have to do anything, but it's the government. So I'd like to put both of them together and ask you this question, Paul. Where do you think the power is coming from? Where do you think the power is coming from?
I think wealth creates power.
Exactly.
And power
So
creates wealth.
that is exactly
It's
the
the
point.
kind of feedback loop that you're talking about.
Yes.
That's where it comes from.
So the power is coming from wealth, right? So that is the inequality issue that we're talking about. So if you ask the Occupy protesters, so the way they would talk about this is that the governments cannot do anything because the businesses have power over them because of the money. So that is why it boils down to the inequality, income and wealth inequality. That's the way I look at it. But yes, it could be definitely seen in terms of power, but to a large extent, I think power arises from your ability to create wealth and control it. So that is where the businesses, I think, have a fairly large role to play.
Let's take another question. There, please.
My name is Konstantin Stud. I'm a student here at University of Manitoba, and this is what I would like to say. Basically, the discussion today was more about wealth inequality. And the question of the panel, I think, was quite importantly asked, was basically, what should business do? And in my opinion, when we discuss Occupy Wall Street, we should first of all figure out that basically business community just got itself a biggest ally. And it might not be clear right away, but if you think about it, I mean, I'm not talking about entire business community, but small and medium business communities. Because if you think about it, the biggest problem for medium-sized businesses, the one that want to manufacture here, for example, in Canada, is that they cannot actually manufacture here because they have to compete with everybody who is exporting from China. And they have no voice. They have very little weight because they're not big enough to compete on political markets. So now what Occupy Wall Street itself represents is basically an opportunity for the small business and middle business community to point out to the Occupy Wall Street and say, look guys, there's a real problem in society, it's structural, how about you address it, and how about you address it along the lines that basically got outlined by Occupy Wall Street. Because if you look at their demands, and the list of demands is actually available, it's not really about socialism. It's not about greatly redistribution of the wealth in society. It's more about how about we fix our political system, how about we introduce regulation in society, how about we put the criminals, the guys who actually caused this crisis, into jail, and once that is done, we go back to basically free market. And in that sense, since, well, I argue that basically Occupy Wall Street is about free market more than anything else.
Can I ask you the question?
It's basically, no, and my basically question is this. Do you actually see this? Like, I mean, do you actually have a sense that business community should be more engaging the Occupy Wall Street instead of trying to oppose it? And which way can they do it? Thank you.
Should business communities be working with and alongside Occupy as opposed to opposing it? Do we have any thoughts from the panel?
I think they should be definitely engaging with the protesters, and I would once again like to say that they probably might be talking about some of the political reforms or regulations changes, but it is called Occupy Wall Street for a reason, right? So I see a meaning in that. So when they say Occupy Wall Street, they are actually asking the businesses to respond. And if you talk to them again, like we've had an opportunity to talk to them and look at a number of things that they're writing and their websites and all that. Definitely they do say that the businesses have power over the governments. So it is the businesses which probably should respond if we need to see any change.
I'm going to take one more question. I think Cam's hand was up earlier. Last question from Cam.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on some of Radhika's comments, some of the stuff that Robert was talking about as well. Radhika, you were telling us that the 50s, 60s, and 70s were kind of the golden age of equality, at least in relative terms. I've heard a couple of other historians refer to that same period as the golden age of labor unions, that unions were particularly strong then, and also the golden age, or the dark age, depending on your perspective, of labor action and strike action and things like that. And the labor economists or the labor historians typically will make the connection between the two and say that it was the strong labor unions that resulted in that level of equality. So I guess the question that I have would be, is there a role for increased labor union movement or activity in the future to try and solve this inequality problem?
Radhika, would you like to speak to that?
Quickly, I'm really glad for that question, because I felt that I didn't make a more fundamental point that I should have made earlier, so it gives me an opportunity to make it. First of all, I just want to say that not only do not only do I think unions do have a very important role to play, but they will actually, first of all, in the first instance, have to expand. And there they will have to expand into new sectors which have, for whatever reason, not been covered, and therefore all sorts of temporary labor, not well protected labor, service sector labor, etc. They'll have to expand as well as, of course, play a bigger role. And I think that the best way to think about this whole process and the place of unions, business, everybody in it is, or one of the good ways of thinking about it is to think about Karl Polanyi's idea of the double movement, which very simply goes like this. He basically argued that market societies were impossible. That is to say, it was impossible to have a society that was completely regulated only by the market, completely and exclusively regulated by the market, and that historically what we witnessed was that it was a double movement, which as market societies spread around the world, they also gave rise to what he called a countervailing movement of social protection. Now this movement can take many forms. It can take the form of unions, it can take the form of cooperatives, etc., but very, very importantly, it hinged on the state. The state was the thing that engaged in three forms of protection: protecting labor, protecting the environment, and oddly enough, protecting business itself from itself. So in all these three ways, so labor, capital, and land, so to speak, were all three protected. And I think that's very important. Now, I think that certainly at this point we're living at a time when the market movement has gone too far, and the countervailing movement has not caught up. So I think definitely that would have to happen. And finally, and the fundamental point I wanted to make is that basically, to go back to Polanyi, the dominant ideology of a modern capitalist society is that the economy is a separate private sector, and then there is a public sector. But reality, to go back to the question of power, the real crux of the power is precisely that modern capitalist states permit, in fact create, the so-called private sector and franchise out a number of important political functions to it. So for example, it says, if you're an entrepreneur, what happens within, in a pure capitalist society, what happens within your factory is not our business. Of course, it has taken years of campaigning by unions and other agitators and whatever to say, no, it is public business. Unions should be allowed to organize, vulnerable sectors should be protected, etc., etc. And precisely it is, so in a sense, if you simply say, well, the private sector is the private sector, then that is when capital has the greatest power. And historically what has happened is that movements of people, unions and other movements have organized to demand more. And they have usually got it because actually at the end of the day, purely market or purely capitalist societies have never existed. And if they ever do, then that will be the self-destruction of human society.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, I'd like to call on our president at this time for his thoughts as we draw this to a close. Over to you, David.
Thank you. Well, I have negative time, so that's good, since we were done a couple of minutes ago. And that reduces the challenge of having to synthesize ideas out of such a complex conversation. But let me just respond to the two issues that I think were laid out by Reg at the beginning as things that I would try and deal with. One is, why should business address economic inequality, or should it not? I think it's clear from, and this is synthesized from my understanding of what I've heard from the panelists. I think it's clear that all the panelists were saying business should, both for lack of time to think of better qualifications, I would refer to as an internal orientation and an external orientation. Internally, Hari gave us that intriguing view of a pyramid that looked like it could tip one way or the other, and was trying to be shored up. I mean, in the limit, there's the concern, I guess, as to whether the system is stable or not in its current configuration, and a number of suggestions that it's not. But also, I think from several of the speakers, the notion of growing the capacity of the economy to make the business itself successful. I mean, Radhika's characterization that inequality depresses aggregate demand, and so from an internal perspective, there's certainly reason to be engaged. From an external orientation, I think again many of the speakers were aligned, and I don't mean in this summary to set aside the nuances, but I think many people saying business should not be only about profit, but certainly other things to keep in mind. We hear a lot about corporate social responsibility with respect to businesses in Canada, or have heard in the last few years. There were some examples of things that panelists mentioned. Hari talked about providing products, doing product design based on more than just the ability to sell, but what might be particularly useful in the economy. Many people talked about managing the salary ratio between high and low salaries. Brent talked about paying attention not just to the broader community, but to the local community for these things, and Rick was talking about world peace through world trade and the entailments of globalization, some of which are good and some of which are not so good. Radhika's comment about businesses being able to see themselves as organizers rather than just as profit makers, I think, is in that same category. The second question that I was asked to address, I think, is to rebut to some extent the observation of Hari's acquaintance that university professors don't do anything useful, but they make money, and suggest that university professors actually can do something useful in this regard. And I think one is the generalization from this last hour and a half that we've spent together, and that is to really engage in thinking about what the economy is and who it's for, as Reg had framed the question earlier, and pressing deeply to understand. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is being in the position of president of a university, a person gets to bump into, not to get engaged in detailed conversations with everyone, but bump into many different people and see different perspectives and get a sense of cultures within disciplines and cultures within departments and cultures within faculties. And there's a complexity surrounding a lot of these issues that we're talking about today. So I think one of the things that the Academy can do, that faculty members can do, is pursue this goal of discovery and research and understanding, and to pursue it deeply, right? And listen to each other and communicate fully. And this kind of thing is a very useful example of a step in that direction. The world is complex beyond what we often admit in our quick summaries of the positions that we take with each other. And I think the thing that gives us hope as academics is that as we engage at substantial levels of detail and seek substantial understanding, we can actually find common ground. Second thing I think that faculty can do, and the university can do, is engage in this kind of conversation in the larger community, so that people who have studied deeply and thought carefully about these things really have a responsibility, I think, in a context where we are funded by public money. We have the opportunity and the responsibility to participate in shaping policy by informed conversation, not just intramurally, but extramurally outside the academy, shaping policy and advising business on these things. And then finally, I think one of the most substantial things that can happen in the university, what can faculty members do, is teach students to see the world from a position of course, from the knowledge of their own domains, whatever they're studying, whether it's computer science or anthropology. I'm a computer scientist, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with anthropology too. I'm even okay with business. So to see the world from a perspective of the specific knowledge, specialized knowledge of one's own domain, but also to see the world from a position of personal social responsibility and collective social responsibility. And I think one of the things that this kind of conversation can remind us is that that's an important collection of things that we need to help our students understand, not just the specific sort of details of the domain knowledge, but what does it mean to leave with that kind of knowledge and participate in a society that has inequities that I think all of us, everyone here at the front and probably everyone in the room agrees, are simply not acceptable moving forward.
Thank you very much. And thank you to our panelists this afternoon, and thanks to each one of you for taking time out of your Friday afternoon. And I do want to take one special moment to thank Scott McCullough, who was absolutely instrumental in pulling together these two panels these last 2 days. Thank you for coming, and if you join me now in thanking the panel and Scott.